The sky was dark when Daniel parked his car at the roadside motel. The engine hummed low before falling silent, leaving the surroundings in an unsettling stillness. He sighed, adjusting the hood of his jacket as he stepped out of the vehicle. The night shift at the motel wasn't his dream job, but it paid the bills while he searched for something better. This was just another temporary stop, he thought. The motel had a rundown appearance, with dim lights flickering on the partially burnt-out sign. The exterior walls were worn, as if time and neglect had eroded the life out of the place. A cold wind blew, causing the lobby windows to rattle slightly. Daniel pushed open the glass door and walked inside. The reception was deserted, except for an old radio crackling on the counter. The manager, a middle-aged man with an unshaven face, looked up from behind a newspaper. "Ah, you must be the new night guy," he said in a raspy voice. "That's right, Daniel," the young man replied, offering a timid smile. "Well, here's the key to the storage room. You'll need it. And a word of advice. The night shift can get lonely, so enjoy the peace," the manager said, with an odd tone that didn't go unnoticed by Daniel. He took the key, mumbled something about the tasks he'd need to do, and left without further explanation. Daniel took a quick look around the reception area, noticing the yellowed walls and the musty odor that seemed to permeate the air. In the corner, a wilted, dusty plant kept silent company with the absent receptionist. He picked up the worn operations manual and started reading about the night duties, checking vacant rooms, doing minor cleaning, and ensuring everything was in order for the occasional guests. As he passed the keys hanging on the wall, he noticed one in particular, the key to room 12. It was an old key, rusted in places. The number was partially faded but still recognizable. Curious, Daniel stared at it for a few seconds before shaking his head. He closed the cabinet and decided to start his nightly rounds. The motel's hallways were long and dark, lit by low-wattage bulbs casting unsettling shadows on the walls. As he walked, Daniel heard only the sound of his own footsteps and the faint hum of the lights. The air seemed to grow heavier as he passed a particular door, room 12. A strange feeling crept over Daniel, as if something was out of place. He paused for a moment and looked at the door handle, waiting to hear any noise or sign that the room was occupied. Nothing, just the heavy silence of the hallway. Shaking his head, he forced himself to move on. The first night passed without major incidents, but there was something in the air that didn't sit well with him. When he returned to the reception, he found the manager slipping out quietly, waving casually. "Good luck," he muttered before disappearing into the dark night. Daniel stood there, staring at the emptiness of the motel before him, with the sense that this would be a long and lonely journey. The next night, Daniel arrived at the motel a little earlier than the start of his shift. The air was colder, and a thin mist covered the road, creating an even more desolate atmosphere around the place. The silence was absolute, except for the distant sound of a truck passing by on the road. He entered the lobby, greeted the manager who was leaving, and prepared for another long night. This time, something bothered him more than before. Since the first night, he couldn't shake the strange feeling he'd had when passing by room 12. It was as if there was something different about that space, an invisible weight he couldn't explain. He laughed at himself, thinking he was probably just letting his imagination run wild, influenced by the motel's grim environment. However, this night would be different. Just a few hours into his shift, while doing his usual rounds through the hallways, Daniel noticed a faint sound. A soft creaking echoed down the corridor, coming directly from room 12. He stopped, trying to listen more carefully. The sound resembled a door slowly opening, or maybe it was just old furniture creaking. "Must be the wind," he muttered to himself, though he knew that didn't make much sense. The rooms were closed, and the hallway was sealed. Yet the sound persisted, low but constant. Curious and slightly apprehensive, Daniel approached the door to room 12. His heart began to race for no clear reason. He reached out for the handle, hesitating for a moment. As he touched the cold metal surface, the creaking suddenly stopped, leaving a thick silence in the air. He took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door was unlocked. Slowly, he pushed it open, and the door creaked as it swung, revealing the room inside. At first glance, it looked like any other room. The bed was made, an old TV sat in the corner, and a mirror hung on the opposite wall. However, the air in the room felt much colder than in the hallways. Daniel stepped inside, feeling a chill run up his spine. As he walked further in, something caught his eye. The mirror in the room was slightly fogged, as if someone had just taken a hot shower, but the bathroom was dry and untouched. He approached the mirror, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a blurred figure reflected, standing right behind him. He turned quickly, but no one was there. His eyes returned to the mirror. The figure had vanished. Daniel hurried out of the room, shutting the door behind him with force. His hands shook slightly, and he tried to convince himself he was just tired and letting the eerie atmosphere get to him. It was just his mind playing tricks. Nothing more. Back at the reception, he tried to focus on his usual tasks, but the persistent feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave him alone. Every time he looked at the keys hanging on the wall, the one for room 12 seemed to call his attention. The rust on the key and the almost faded number now seemed like a symbol of something he still couldn't understand but knew was closer than he wanted to admit. As the night went on, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen in the mirror or the strange coldness that hung over room 12. Something inside him told him this wasn't just coincidence. Something was happening in that motel, something far beyond his comprehension. And he knew, somehow, that he was only beginning to uncover what was really going on. The next night, Daniel arrived at work with his mind still occupied by the events in room 12. The previous night's receptionist gave him a strange look as he left, as if he knew something Daniel hadn't yet discovered. Throughout the shift, Daniel tried to keep his mind busy, resisting the temptation to return to that room. However, his curiosity seemed to grow with every passing hour. Around midnight, a guest entered the lobby. He was a middle-aged man, wearing a worn-out coat and looking tired, clearly having come from a long journey. Daniel greeted him with the usual courtesy, offering the available room options. Any room except 12, the man said, casually but with an odd familiarity. The remark caught Daniel off guard. Why not room 12? It's just a regular room, right? The man laughed, a short, dry sound, before shaking his head. If that's what you think, well, I've stayed here before. Room 12 has a weird vibe. I never sleep well when I stay there, and I know other people who prefer to avoid it too. Daniel tried to hide the chill that ran down his spine upon hearing that. Weird how? I can't explain it exactly. It's like the room has a heavy energy, you know? Once, I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was standing next to the bed, watching me. But when I turned on the light, no one was there. Just silence. I haven't stayed there since. The guest took the key to another room, thanked him, and headed upstairs, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. The simple but disturbing story only reinforced the unease that had been consuming him since he had opened that door the night before. There was something more in that room, something people seemed to feel but couldn't explain. Daniel decided not to tell the guest about what he had seen himself. After all, he couldn't even explain what had happened. Maybe it was all in his head. But now, with this account, it was hard to deny that something more sinister was at play. Later that night, while going about his tasks, Daniel ran into another employee who had worked at the motel for years, a man named Miguel. They exchanged a few words occasionally, but that night, Daniel decided to ask directly. Hey Miguel, have you ever heard anything about room 12? It seems like people have strange stories about it. Miguel was silent for a moment, his once relaxed expression now growing serious. He glanced around, as if making sure no one else could hear, before answering in a low, careful tone. Room 12, something happened there a long time ago. I was working here at the time and the whole thing was pretty dark. He hesitated, seeming to debate whether to continue. A woman died in that room. Some say it was suicide, others think there was more to it. Ever since then, the room hasn't been the same. Daniel swallowed hard. What do you mean by not the same? Miguel gave a half smile, humorless. People who stay there often report strange things. Voices, shadows, the feeling of being watched. Some say they've seen the woman, like she's still trapped there. I personally prefer not to mess with it. You should do the same. Daniel thanked him for the information, but the discomfort only grew. The woman's death seemed to have left deep scars, and the silence around the incident made it seem like the motel carried a dark secret, buried under years of quiet and neglect. He wondered if he should really follow Miguel's advice and stay away, or if he needed to find out for himself what was lurking behind the shadows of Room 12. The thought of the woman who had died in Room 12 didn't leave Daniel's mind. The next night, curiosity overcame fear. He needed to know more. Miguel's words echoed in his head. I prefer not to mess with that. But for Daniel, the silence was unbearable, and he couldn't just leave the subject alone. Something was calling to him, as if Room 12 was waiting for him. In the maintenance room, where the motel's old records and documents were kept, Daniel found a box of yellowed papers. Among the guest receipts and check-in forms, he found what appeared to be an old logbook, dating back more than 20 years. The pages were faded, and the handwriting almost illegible, but he persisted. He knew the key to the mystery lay there, hidden among the faded words. Flipping quickly through the pages, he found something that caught his attention. A handwritten note, in faded blue ink, mentioned an incident in Room 12. The date matched Miguel's account. The woman who had stayed there, named Clara Martins, had been found dead in the room. The official cause, suicide. But the note was too brief, without details of what might have driven Clara to take her own life. It didn't seem enough to explain the frightening stories surrounding the room. Daniel continued to search through the records until he found an old newspaper clipping, cut out and stored with the documents. The headline said it all. Woman found dead in motel after being abandoned by lover. The article explained that Clara had checked into the motel, waiting for a man who had promised to meet her, but he never showed up. Her despair led to what seemed to be her final decision. However, some witnesses mentioned that Clara's death had been surrounded by unusual occurrences. The manager at the time reported strange noises coming from the room on the night Clara died. Sounds that resembled furniture being dragged or someone banging on the walls. A guest in the next room claimed to have heard whispers, but thought it was just part of a couple's argument. No one suspected Clara was about to die until it was too late. Reading the article, Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. The pain and despair Clara had felt before her death seemed to have seeped into the walls of Room 12, like a permanent scar. Somehow, the motel had absorbed that tragedy, and now it manifested in inexplicable ways. However, there was still something Daniel couldn't understand. How had this persisted for so long? Clara's death had occurred decades ago, and yet, the strangeness in the room continued, as if her spirit was trapped, unable to move on. He closed the logbook carefully, feeling the weight of the newly uncovered information. The mystery of Room 12 was beginning to unravel, but he knew there was still more to discover. Daniel spent the rest of the night lost in thought. The images of what he had read about Clara Martins haunted him, and he couldn't stop wondering what it would be like to be trapped in a place, reliving the moments of your own death, night after night. Was that what was happening to Clara? Was she still there, somehow waiting for something or someone? The silence in the motel felt heavier that night, as if even the building knew its secrets were being unearthed. Daniel glanced down the hallway where Room 12 was located, feeling a nearly palpable presence coming from that direction. He promised himself that the next time he had the chance, he would confront the room again, this time, armed with the truth. The following nights brought a noticeable shift in the atmosphere for Daniel. Since the discovery about Clara Martins, Room 12 was no longer just a curiosity. Now, it felt like a constant weight on his mind, an invisible presence that surrounded him even outside of work. He began having disturbing dreams, all somehow connected to the room. In one of the nightmares, he found himself standing in the motel's hallway, facing the door to Room 12. The doorknob turned slowly, as if something or someone on the other side was trying to open it. Daniel wanted to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. When the door finally opened, The cold that emanated from inside the room hit him like a blast of icy wind, and a female figure appeared in the shadows, her eyes fixed on him, empty, as if begging for help. Before he could move, the figure rushed toward him, and he woke up with a stifled scream, his heart racing. These dreams became recurring, the figure of the woman always the same, always pleading with her silent gaze. Daniel knew, even without words, that it was Clara. He could feel the pain and despair she carried, as if his soul was somehow connected to hers by an invisible thread. During the day, he tried to ignore the dreams and go about his routine. But the nights at the motel, under the dim hallway lights and the distant hum of passing cars, became almost unbearable. Whenever he passed by room 12, Daniel felt the temperature drop, as if the room was isolated in a bubble of cold and sadness. Even other guests started to avoid that part of the hallway. He noticed that even when the motel was nearly full, no one chose room 12. One night, while making his rounds, Daniel clearly heard the sound of knocking. It was soft, but constant, as if someone were trying to get out from inside the room. He stopped in the middle of the hallway, his heart pounding, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just the plumbing or the wind, but wind didn't knock like that. He approached the door to room 12, his fingers trembling slightly as he held the key. The doorknob was cold to the touch, colder than any other door in the motel. He slowly turned the key and opened the door, expecting to see the same empty room as always. But this time, something was different. The air in the room was heavier, as if there was a real presence, something that shouldn't be there. The light flickered slightly before stabilizing, and Daniel had the distinct feeling that he wasn't alone. As he approached the mirror, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. The mirror was fogged again, and this time, the figure he had seen in his nightmare was there, standing behind him. He spun around quickly, but the room was empty. The figure had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Yet the cold remained, and the feeling that he was being watched lingered. Daniel left the room as fast as he could, slamming the door behind him, trying to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. In the days that followed, the nightmares worsened. Now, Clara appeared more frequently, and in his dreams, she tried to communicate, her lips moving silently as if pleading for help. Daniel always woke up just as she approached, his heart pounding and cold sweat on his brow. He knew he couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. There was something Clara wanted, something he needed to discover. But with every step toward the truth, the fear grew. What did she really want from him? And why did he, of all people, seem to be the one chosen to uncover this mystery? Daniel didn't have the answer yet, but one thing was certain. He was deeply connected to room 12 and Clara's fate, and the more he tried to run from it, the more the past pulled him back. Chapter 6: The Supernatural Encounter. The night was dark, and a violent storm was approaching. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Daniel, sitting at the reception desk, watched the windows shake with the force of the wind. He knew it would be a long night, but not just because of the weather. Since the nightmares had begun to torment him, something inside him knew this night would be different. It was as if the motel, and more specifically room 12, had been waiting for him. As the storm advanced, the motel was emptier than usual. Only 2 or 3 rooms were occupied, and the hallways were a desert of shadows and silence. It was nearly midnight when Daniel heard the sound that made him freeze. The soft, insistent knocking coming from room 12. This time, the knocks were louder, stronger, as if someone were desperate to get out. Daniel hesitated for a moment, his heart racing. He knew something awaited him inside, but running was no longer an option. Clara was trapped, and somehow he knew he needed to free her or confront whatever was in there with her. With trembling hands, Daniel grabbed the key to room 12. He walked slowly down the hallways, the sound of his footsteps almost drowned out by the thunder roaring outside. When he reached the door to the room, the knocking suddenly stopped, and silence fell over the hallway like a weight. He turned the key in the lock, and the door creaked open with an ear-splitting sound. The air inside the room was colder than ever. It was as if he had stepped into another world, separate from the motel. The light flickered violently, casting shadows that danced on the walls. In the center of the room stood a figure, facing away from him. The female silhouette, with long hair falling over her shoulders, was unmistakable. Clara. Daniel swallowed hard, unable to move for a moment. The figure didn't budge. She just stood there, as if waiting for him. Finally, with all the courage he could muster, he took a step forward. "Clara?" His voice came out weaker than he had expected. "What do you want?" The figure slowly turned toward him. Clara's face was pale, her eyes empty and sad. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, she began to move toward him, gliding smoothly over the floor, as if she were trapped in an endless loop of suffering. Daniel instinctively stepped back, panic starting to take hold. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pulsing with a dark energy. Clara continued to approach, her eyes fixed on his, filled with pain. He tried to speak, but his throat felt dry, the words caught in fear. When Clara was just a few steps away, she stopped. Daniel froze, feeling the air around him grow almost unbearably heavy. That's when he heard it, not with his ears, but with his mind. A single word, clear and sharp. "Help." That single word, laden with anguish, cut through Daniel like a blade. He understood that Clara was trapped there, reliving the moment of her death, unable to move on. She was stuck in that room, in that pain, waiting for someone who could free her. Daniel slowly approached her, fighting against the fear still gripping his body. "How can I help you?" he asked, his voice stronger now, driven by the empathy he felt for her. Clara raised her hand and pointed to the mirror in the corner of the room. The mirror where Daniel had so often seen her figure. He looked at the object, realizing something was different. The surface of the mirror seemed to ripple, as if it were made of water. Cautiously, he approached it, watching as his reflection disappeared, replaced by a vision he would never forget. In the mirror, he saw Clara on the night of her death. She sat on the bed, crying, with a crumpled letter in her hands. The despair on her face was palpable. The sound of the wind howling outside and the faint knocking on the door, coming from somewhere, completed the scene. But then what he saw next made him shudder. In the reflected scene, Clara was not alone. In the corner of the room, a dark, tall, and indistinct figure moved silently. It was as if a living shadow was watching her, feeding on her suffering. The figure slowly approached Clara as she cried, and that was when Daniel realized the terrible truth. Clara didn't take her own life. Something had led her to that fate. The mirror darkened, and Daniel was thrust back into the reality of room 12. Clara stood before him, the pain in her eyes now more evident than ever. She wasn't just trapped by her own sadness. She was being held there by a malevolent force, something that still haunted that place. Daniel stood still, his mind racing with the revelation he had just witnessed. It wasn't just Clara's suffering that kept her trapped in that room. There was something much darker and more sinister there. The shadowy figure he had seen in the mirror, the same one that had approached Clara on the night of her death, was the key to everything. Daniel knew that somehow, this being had manipulated the events of that fateful night. Clara was still standing before him, her ghostly presence stronger than ever. Her eyes seemed to plead for something, and Daniel finally understood. She couldn't rest as long as that force remained there. He had to find a way to free her, but how could he confront something so ancient and powerful? I'll help you, he whispered, more to himself than to her. Clara didn't respond, but her expression softened slightly, as if Daniel's promise had given her a glimmer of hope. Looking around the room, he tried to remember if there was anything in the old records that might indicate how Clara could be freed. He turned his gaze back to the mirror, now opaque and inert, and realized that this object was the point of connection. It was through the mirror that he had seen Clara's past, and perhaps it was through the mirror that he could free her. Without hesitation, Daniel approached the mirror and touched its cold surface. Nothing happened. He tried to focus, imagining the scene of Clara's death once more, but the mirror remained unyielding. The feeling of helplessness began to wash over him. How could he fight an invisible, inhuman force? How could he free Clara if he didn't even understand the nature of the entity? That's when Daniel felt the air change. The room, already cold, grew even colder, as if the very air had been drained of life. He knew he was no longer alone. The dark presence, the same one he had seen in the mirror, was there with him, though invisible. Daniel's heart began to race, but he couldn't back down now, not with Clara depending on him. Suddenly, the light in the room flickered violently, and Daniel felt something pass through him, like a tangible shadow, cold and heavy. His lungs seemed to freeze for a moment, and he fell to his knees, gasping. The entity was there, stronger than ever, and its intention was clear. It wouldn't let Clara go. It wouldn't let Daniel survive. Struggling to stand, Daniel tried to speak, but his voice seemed caught in his throat. The fear was suffocating, and for a moment he thought he was lost. But then, something unexpected happened. Clara's figure appeared beside him, now more solid, more defined. She knelt next to him, her eyes fixed on his. There was a new determination in her expression, as if she knew this was the moment to be freed, but she needed his help to do so. Feeling a renewed strength, Daniel looked again at the mirror. He knew it was the only way. With one last effort, he stood up and, with all the strength he could gather, smashed the mirror with his hands, shattering the surface into 1,000 pieces. A sharp scream, like the sound of a howling wind, filled the room. The invisible entity seemed to cry out in agony as the mirror broke. At that moment, the cold in the room began to dissipate. The air grew lighter, and the oppressive feeling that had dominated the atmosphere finally lifted. Daniel looked around, panting, feeling the relief wash over him. Clara was still there, but now, instead of pain and despair, there was a look of peace on her face. She gazed at Daniel with a silent thank you before she began to fade away, her figure softly dissolving into the air. For the first time, Clara was free. Daniel collapsed into a chair by the bed, exhausted but relieved. The room now felt like just a regular room. The weight that had once hung in the air was gone, and the silence that remained was comforting, no longer unsettling. As he looked at the broken shards of the mirror on the floor, Daniel realized he had done what many others before him could not. He had freed a soul trapped on the threshold between two worlds. But more than that, he had faced something much larger than himself, a dark force that had haunted that place for decades. But as he relaxed, his mind still racing with the events, one last doubt crept in. If that entity had been defeated, where had it gone? The days following that night passed strangely for Daniel. The motel, once a place of suffocating shadows and mysteries, now seemed like just another rundown building by the roadside. The weight he had felt for so long had lifted, and room 12, once shrouded in an oppressive aura, was now just another room. The doors remained closed, and no one spoke about what had happened there anymore. Daniel, however, couldn't completely detach himself from the events of that night. The shattered mirror had been removed, and the motel manager, unaware of the truth, dismissively mentioned some act of vandalism in room 12. Daniel just nodded, keeping what really happened to himself. He knew the entity had been defeated, that Clara was finally at peace, but the marks of what he had experienced were still deeply etched in his mind. He also knew that the experience had changed him. The fear, tension, and confrontation with the unknown had transformed him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend yet. At night, when he lay down to sleep, he still found himself questioning what else existed beyond the veil of reality, what other horrors or mysteries might be lurking, waiting to be uncovered. But for now, he was at peace with what he had done. Clara had found rest, and the motel was no longer a place of torment for lost souls. The dark entity, whatever its nature, had disappeared, and with it, the feeling that room 12 was anything more than a simple physical space. A few days later, as Daniel finished his shift, a new employee arrived to replace him. The manager had hired someone to cover the night shifts, as Daniel had requested a transfer to the daytime. The young man, who seemed new to the job, appeared enthusiastic, despite the motel's rundown appearance. Daniel, for his part, watched the new employee with a mixture of relief and concern. He knew what that motel could hide, but he felt his time there was ending. Before leaving, Daniel walked over to the key cabinet. He looked at the spot where the key to room 12 used to hang. Now it was there, shiny and new, replaced by a more modern version, without the rust and wear that the old one had carried. He held it for a moment, feeling a familiar shiver, before placing it back in its place. As he crossed the hallway for the last time, Daniel couldn't help but cast one final glance at the door to room 12. The shadow of that place had followed him for so long, but now, finally, he felt free. He hoped the new employee would never have to know what had really happened there, that the mystery would remain buried with Clara. But as he prepared to leave, an unsettling feeling washed over him, like a faint breeze of cold air passing through his body. He turned, facing the door to room 12 once more, and for a brief second, he thought he saw a shadow pass through the crack of the door. He blinked, and the vision disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Shaking his head, Daniel left the hallway, but not without offering one last warning to the new employee, who was arranging his things at the reception desk. "If I were you," he said with a light smile, but with a shadow of seriousness in his eyes, "I'd stay away from room 12. The young man laughed, unaware of the real weight behind that advice, and waved it off casually. Daniel left the motel, feeling the cool night air on his face as he walked toward his car. The sky was clear, the stars softly shining above. For the first time in weeks, he felt truly light, as if a burden had finally been lifted from his shoulders. But as he drove away from the motel, something inside him told him the story of that place wasn't completely finished. And perhaps one day the new employee would understand why room 12 should be avoided. Because although the entity had been driven away and Clara had found peace, certain presences never truly disappear. They simply linger, waiting for the right moment to return.